Another thing I want to ask you both about, and thank you both for sharing about that, was the use of sexual violence and also the discourse around it. I mean, we see the New York Times had this report that's been discredited, but of course the damage is done in many ways. And we saw a lot of atrocity propaganda, that rape was used as a weapon, a mass weapon on October 7th. We've seen that story was not journalism. It was basically fake news and atrocity propaganda. But I know just from speaking to people, I mean, I've heard countless people use that story to justify what America is doing, regardless of whether or not it's true. And at the same time, we've seen there were recent reports of sexual violence against Palestinian women and girls in Gaza. And we've seen photo after photo of Israeli soldiers with women's lingerie. So I wanted to know your thoughts on this display of sexual violence that's being ignored on the one hand, and then sexual violence that did not happen that's being talked about by the New York Times and other legacy media.
Yes, of course. We have heard many fabricated stories about sexual violence being committed on October 7th. We haven't seen any evidence. I mean, I totally believe women when they say they were raped, but, we didn't hear any testimonies of any woman giving testimonies. On the other hand, we have seen UN reports of hostages that were taken from Gaza, female hostages that were kidnapped by Israeli soldiers who suffered sexual abuse. We have heard testimonies, and there was a UN report as well about Palestinian female political prisoners in Israeli prison, which were facing also sexual violence and sexual abuse. We have heard many testimonies and read many testimonies from hostages, Palestinian hostages and political prisoners who were also facing sexual abuse and threats for rape. I have one thing to say about it. It's part of the fabrication and lies that Israel and its allies continue to use in order to create more chaos and more fear. And I think it's very important that we see it clearly and we're not distracted from our collective efforts to end the ongoing genocide on Palestinians in Gaza right now.
Yeah, I'll just also add that, for me, it's so tied in with pinkwashing, because one of the things, a very typical racist and colonizer move is to say that the people you're trying to colonize, do sexuality wrong. And so to say that they're sexist and homophobic, and this is, when Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State gave her famous speech about how gay rights are human rights, she was saying, we're going to now justify the war on terror by saying that these countries are too homophobic and we need to bomb them. That's the move. And there's such a long history of that, colonizers, who colonized Hawaii, who colonized the US, who colonized South Africa, the thing they say is these people, the way they treat their women is wrong, or they don't live in the kind of family group we think they should, or they're not modest. They don't wear European clothing. They don't do European gender norms. We need to save them, civilize them, and colonize them. That's the same thing that Ghadir was saying earlier about how Palestinians are framed as being too homophobic. Here in the US, there's narratives about Black and Latino people being more homophobic that are completely made up, that are used to justify the idea that certain people are backwards and that they're not, cutting edge and not progressive, all of that. So this is just a long journey. And of course that narrative is going to come through. And that always also goes with the colonizer using sexual violence against the colonized. I mean, so to me, it feels very classic. And it's very hard for all of us who are feminists, who are let's take sexual violence extremely seriously, especially as something that occurs, in the context of militarism, very relentlessly, all over the world, and especially U.S. militarism, I'll add, which Israeli militarism has a lot of similarities to. And so it's very difficult the way that these kind of disingenuous narratives about caring about sexual violence get played by the very people who are creating conditions that'll guarantee more sexual violence. And when I see all these images of Israeli soldiers holding Palestinians naked at gunpoint, that is sexual violence. When you strip search people, that is sexual violence. It's so routine. It's throughout, right? Imprisoning people and inevitably stripping them, which is always part of that, is sexual violence. It's routine. And that's part of Israeli day-to-day action against Palestinians for all these years. There's just so much that's not discussed about how sexual violence is inescapably part of the settler colonial project of the U.S. and of South Africa and of Israel and all the places that are doing that tactic.
Right. So it's almost mundane. I mean, it's so built into it that we don't sometimes even realize it.
Right. And also just, in terms of sexual and reproductive justice, like what we really care about. How can you have sexual and reproductive justice when you're being pushed out of your home, when your parts of your family are being bombed to death, when you can't eat, when you don't have clothing? Like our vision of what the freedom is that we believe in as feminists is these kind of like disingenuous use of allegations about sexual violence that are very cherry picked and don't look at the context, really misses like the sort of robust idea about sexual freedom that could never include genocide, could never include having these militaries.
Yeah, I actually interviewed a Palestinian American Michigan college student who was part of some panel on Face the Nation. And she said that she's not going to vote for Biden, definitely not in the primary. I don't think she'll vote for him in the general either. But she was saying that reproductive freedom and reproductive justice is really important to her. And she couldn't vote for someone overseeing a genocide where women were giving birth on the streets without having C-sections, without anesthesia, not having any, neonatal or prenatal care.
Yeah, but Biden is paying to bomb hospitals. If you care about women, about children, about babies, and before October 7th, there's been this long history of the United States paying for Israel to have this separation or, apartheid wall, as we call it, that ensures that people will not be able to get the healthcare they need around their reproductive health. Every aspect of apartheid and genocide and colonialism is at odds with reproductive freedom.